It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And we are doing a bonus episode right quick because the news of Conor McGregor being civilly liable for the rape of Nikita Hand has dominated the headlines all day. So John and I decided to cut a small episode so that we could look at the business aspects for both the UFC and Conor McGregor in light of this news. But first, let's check in with John and see how he's been over the last 16 hours since I spoke to him.
Not much has changed. No, I'm doing fine. I just, we're of course, we're going to focus on the business side of this story. Hopefully it doesn't come across as too sleazy, but that's you go where fan interest, the reader interest is a timely news story. So that is why we're covering it.
Exactly. And if you're expecting us to weigh in one way or the other personally, we're not going to do that. You can visit our socials for that. For right now, this is strictly about the business aspects.
Yeah, though I think I think our tone will probably give it away what we think.
Sure.
And I will say, all these people, you no longer, as I put on Twitter, you no longer have to say alleged rapist,
Right.
Because he is. Even though he wasn't found guilty, he's not criminally liable. He is civilly liable. So he is, unless he gets it overturned on appeal, technically people can call him a rapist and be accurate. He's a civilly liable rapist, to be specific.
Exactly. Now, before we start, I want to remind everyone that we do have a Q&A / ask me anything, as long as it's business related, going for next weekend.
Anything mixed martial arts, UFC, other promotions, boxing, I guess the pro wrestling that we can cover, anything business related.
Yes. So do submit your questions to us. We have multiple handles everywhere. I'll get into that later, but we would love to be able to answer the questions you want to know. Now, without any further ado, let's get right down to our 7 questions we have here. My first question, how important was Conor McGregor to the last broadcast deal, the one that we're currently in right now?
Fairly important, actually. I mean, Conor McGregor is the biggest star in UFC history. I think that's without a doubt. Maybe the most important star, I think you could kind of make an argument, might have been Ken Shamrock, but you got to get in the weeds to explain why it would be Ken Shamrock, because he came in when they're losing money and he kind of, built them up to the point where they get the tough show going. I could see that argument. But besides him, at that period of time, Ken Shamrock was never the attraction as much as he was a star at that time. Never the attraction. McGregor's has the highest gates, ticket sales. In fact, when he showed up and they started selling tickets with him, it just blew away anybody before him. Highest pay-per-views by far. Also, when Endeavor bought the UFC, people remember, they paid a ton for the UFC, took out billions in loans. They didn't have high interest rates at the time, but had to pay large amount of money in for those loan repayments. And this was before the ESPN deal. So the UFC was not making the kind of money they are now. It was a very profitable promotion, but they were making several $100 million less per year. And all the additional money is basically profit and, earnings. So that's what makes the huge difference when they go to the next level on TV deals and sponsorship. It's basically all profit because they have fixed costs. That was the one time basically where the UFC was at risk because they had this large debt and they didn't have the new TV deal yet. And Conor McGregor was there to generate a lot of money for them to keep them afloat with the Mayweather fight, with the Khabib fight. So he was very important at that part. And because he was selling that much, and they did, you look at the decks they were using, the advertising decks they were using, the promotional, what they were selling to the networks, Conor McGregor was a big selling point. They were selling at the time, we will have Conor McGregor fights when you go to the new network, ESPN, when they signed up with him. In fact, he was their first big rollout. You remember they signed that deal, and they had like Dustin Poirier versus, I believe it was Max Holloway. I think that was the first one they did on ESPN. That sold like 50,000 buys. Did terrible for ESPN. But at the next year, after a full year, they did their big premiere kind of rollout for fight for ESPN Plus with Conor McGregor, broke 1 million, added 500,000 subscribers for that one show. And so he was a big selling part to get that TV deal. And he was a big part of why it suddenly took off and sold a ton of pay-per-views and tons of subscriptions to make it worthwhile for ESPN. Because at that point, ESPN was very happy basically from that point on with the deal. So I guess from the point of view of how important was he was a major selling point. I mean, the UFC, part of their selling point, we will always have stars. We own the sport. We will build new stars. But they basically use Conors like, here's the guy we're going to bring to you. He's going to sell big. And this is the type of stars that the UFC can create. And at the time, it did kind of look like the UFC was creating those type of stars because it wasn't just him. It was Ronda Rousey. There was, no one selling like Conor, but they did have several people that blew up, and it made it look like the UFC could just generate these guys left and right.
How much do you think his losses, just his losses, have affected his star power and marketability?
In some ways, you'd have to say it hasn't affected them too much because his buys have stayed very strong. He has a very strong fan base. Even with his losses coming off of, Mayweather he lost to, Dustin twice, and then before that he lost to Nate Diaz. So he's been like two out of the last 6 he's been won. So not a spectacular record, but based on what we saw in the ticket sales versus Chandler at the gate, what it was estimated it was going to do, it looks like there's still strong demand for him. And so I would think he still has a strong fan base. The question is, which we don't have a counterfactual, is what would happen if he had won some of those big fights? How big a star would he have been if he had, let's say, Mayweather had heart palpitations or something bizarre happened and he actually did better than that. What would happen if he beat Khabib, if he caught Khabib and knocked him out? I mean, we don't know. We don't have a counterfactual world we can look at and say this is how big a star he could have got. But it does not look, based on the level of which he reached, it does not look like the losses have hurt him. In fact, in some ways, he's gotten even a bigger star after the second Dustin, or the third, I should say. The third Dustin Poirier fight was bigger than the second. There has been some growth to him stardom in that. The losses don't seem to have hurt him. But again, we don't have a window to another alternate reality where we can look and see how big could he have gotten if he had the wins. Would he be just the same? Is it just people are just attracted to the personality? Or would the victories have catapulted him to another level? We don't know.
Would that level have been considered Michael Jordan level? Let me clarify for just a moment. I don't mean by ability. I mean by star power.
Michael Jordan is at a level that's basically, there's Ali, Jordan, Tiger Woods in some ways. I mean, Jordan, I think, is much bigger technically than Tiger Woods, but Tiger Woods as a fan base and it generates a revenue that puts him at that level. Although Tiger Woods, again, is a monster star. He would be, there's a chance if he had won and he'd beaten Khabib and he just kept building on it. I don't know how much bigger he would have gotten. My guess is he would have gotten bigger, but maybe there is a chance he could have been like how Mike Tyson was at one point.
Okay.
That he is just the person everybody has to see, that has a mystique to him that elevates him above every other fighter. It's very possible, I guess, if he had won some of those fights. I mean, especially if he beat Mayweather, it'd be absurd. It's unimaginable that he'd do that. But if he did, I guess it's conceivable he eclipsed Mayweather. In some ways, I think Conor's a bigger star personality with the masses, but Mayweather got more people to dish out money to watch him fight. And so maybe he puts on those type of consistently Mayweather type pay-per-views if he had beaten those guys. But I don't know. It's an alternate reality. I don't know. I don't know if he would have turned people off. I mean, he still has all these other issues outside the cage that could have come back to haunt him.
How much do you think inactivity and partying behavior have affected his star power and marketability? And I'm asking this with a direction pointed at UFC. And are they able to market him as effectively in light of all of the inactivity and partying behavior?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. One is the absence has increased interest because people have been waiting to see him, right? Mm-hmm. You deliver too much of a good thing and people there's not the demand that you can build by having an absence. I think that there is a chance, there's a possibility, and I think there's some truth to it that because after the Mayweather fight, he kind of dropped out and then he had semi-regular fights, his fights actually got bigger. But if he had been fighting consistently like Canelo, maybe his fights wouldn't have been as big, but overall, I think he would have been generating a lot more revenue, right? And his purse, because of the way the UFC structures purses, he personally probably would have made a lot more money through this UFC contract, although he would have taken, of course, a lot more damage and had a lot less fun. Just by me guessing, gut feeling, looking at it, it does look his absence has increased interest in him, that his events have been on higher sales than they would have done, especially the two Dustin fights, than they would have done otherwise. But, maybe it does 10, 20% less. But if you're doing 2 to 3 times as many fights, if you're consistently fighting twice a year, that overall you have generated a lot more money.
What do you think this verdict will do to his star power and marketability?
Gut instinct. But sadly, I do not know if this will hurt him that bad. Because you would think it would, for most athletes, this would ruin your image. But I don't know. Does he have any mainstream endorsements right now?
I am not aware.
Yeah, I don't think he has any anymore. So he has no mainstream endorsements. So he's not going to take. He endorses his own products. Now he's still going to do that. Sadly, his fan base has a tremendous overlap with like the Andrew Tates. And so I do not see them rejecting. In fact, I'm sure they find him innocent and blame the other side for what's happened.
They do. And it's already been posted and shared everywhere. Yep.
So that's who you're dealing with. And the other thing is, in the United States, the mass of fans, the large numbers, are very casual. They're not paying attention to this case or story, really. Or they might have heard it briefly, but they're not really paying attention. This is going to be somewhat like Tyson, but sped up much quicker. That Tyson was gone, went to prison, and then he came back, and the fans flocked to his pay-per-views again, right? Now, I guess the difference with Tyson is Tyson served his time, and I guess you could justify, like, yes, the man went to prison. I'm not going to hold this against him anymore. But in this case, it's a small fine for how rich he is. Again, gut feeling, just based on what I've seen from the fan base. Either they don't care because the fans are completely on his side or have opinions that kind of like the manosphere type opinions, or much larger number of fans just don't care and just don't pay attention.
How much can UFC leverage Conor in the broadcast deal negotiations that are going on now?
I don't think there's much leverage with a different broadcaster with McGregor, because you're talking about a 7 to 10 year deal. You're talking about basically we're only going to have a few McGregor fights before he's done. Who knows if we're ever going to get there? I don't know if a broadcaster would be sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to get a McGregor fight. I think where it helped with ESPN negotiations, because with ESPN is they already have a contract and they're paying a certain amount per pay-per-view, and you could kind of hold that over them like, well, if we resign this better pay-per-view deal with us, we can get some Conor fights in under the old deal as quick as possible. And you guys can sell a ton of pay-per-views, and you guys get to keep a lot of money and make a lot on that. But that only happens if we come to an agreement. On that front, it could be used. I don't know if they're doing it, but it could be used as leverage more with ESPN than with another broadcaster. Because while it's a great way to start the relationship out, that you bring Conor in for 1 or 2 pay-per-views to start it out, that's just 1 or 2 pay-per-views for a brief window out of 100 pay-per-views they're going to end up doing, maybe 120 if it's 10 years, where the current ESPN deal, it's like, well, if we sign this, if we extend this deal and come to agreement, we do get Conor McGregor fights right now. And that makes the current deal more valuable.
Can the UFC affect future purses of Conor's in any way moving forward? And what I mean by that is, if he takes a fight, which I don't think he ever will, but if he did, is there a loophole in there for, say, a code of conduct violation or anything that says that UFC can reduce a previously agreed upon purse, like a contracted purse?
Well, I haven't seen McGregor's contract. I don't know how guaranteed it is. Most contracts, though, have some loopholes. Dan Henderson, when he re-signed from Strikeforce, had a deal that said he cannot be cut he had a 4-fight deal. He could not be cut after any loss. He had to finish out the 4-fight deal. Some fighters do have that. Rare now because the UFC has all the leverage now. So maybe McGregor has a deal that says you can't cut me no matter what. I also suspect he's like thinking UFC will not let me go because I would make more money somewhere else. Someone would be willing to pay me instantly. But there could be something in the contract the UFC could do that and say, we are going to cut you unless you take a pay cut. I don't think in the agreement, my understanding of it, I have not seen it. I just heard, talk to people that they supposedly know details, and some of their details ended up being pretty true on the old one. So I take it with more than a grain of salt. I think they do have some information because the number they'd given me before ended up being almost, very close to what was reported in the antitrust lawsuit compared to the massively inflated numbers everybody else was throwing around. But I think his deal is set. It goes up based on the numbers of the previous event. Since they do good, it's going to keep going up. So I don't see how they can cut it. Maybe they have control over where he can fight. And if they do that, they can put him in a situation where it's not going to sell as many pay-per-views, so he doesn't get the upside that he does. Like they make him fight during the daytime, maybe in Saudi Arabia, which, would be a big deal. But again, usually when you fight during the daytime in Saudi Arabia, the American audience doesn't buy as many pay-per-views. So they could maybe hurt him that way. But I think he's pretty much guaranteed he will make his, 16 to 20 million per fight.
Final question. If you were to predict Conor's future business opportunities, and this is us firing up the Speculatron 9000, how limited would you estimate his future business opportunities would be?
I mean, his biggest opportunities are currently outside the UFC, probably fighting Jake Paul. As stupid as that is, and as much as Mike Tyson kind of bust the bubble on that a little bit, but still, Paul's a bigger star than he ever was. So you get the right opponent. McGregor might be the right opponent in MMA. I think if they did it and not boxing, so he could do that. He could probably sell. The Saudis might pay him a ton to go box Manny Pacquiao, or maybe maybe someone will pay him a ton of money to fight Nate Diaz. Not a ton compared to boxing what he could have made, but more than the UFC contract. But again, because the UFC contracts, they don't pay that high compared to what you would get on a market where things sold. So the options are greater outside the UFC. The question is he going to leave the UFC? And I don't think he's, I don't know if he's ever going to fight again, but he has 2 fights left. And you would think, we've talked about this a lot, you would think he has a sunset clause. He signed his agreement back when they had everybody signing sunset clauses. And the reason they did that is because it was a way to fend off the antitrust lawsuit that was going. I do not believe he has signed a new agreement. In fact, I'm pretty sure he has signed a new agreement because he still talks about he only has 2 fights left. And so he doesn't have the class action waiver unless you count the one that's printed on the bottom of contracts that you don't sign, right? That I don't think anybody would uphold. So he should have a sunset clause. Now, of course, I don't know how long he basically retired. And so I don't know how much longer it's been extended. Or maybe he's made the decision that he's not going to exercise that. Maybe there's some threat. We've theorized, and other people have theorized to me, that there's possibly he has a balloon payment tied to the Mayweather fight or something, or his contract, that when he finishes it, he gets it. So he wants to finish that contract no matter what. That makes sense. No evidence, but it makes sense. That's why he's trying to finish it out. But otherwise, he has, even with this case, even with his image in ruins and tatters with the wider public, he still has options to make tremendous amount of money, specifically outside the UFC. I guess a good one would be him and Nate Diaz, I would imagine, in bare knuckle for the bare knuckle promotion. He gets a percentage of that, and they could probably find someone to put a ton of money for it. That's one possibility. Boxing, a bunch of top boxers, old guys like Manny Pacquiao, the Saudis would pay him. Fighting Jake Paul. So there's options to make tens upon tens of millions for a few fights outside the UFC. But for basically, it's the UFC has 2 fights left. He's tied to. That's his options here. And I don't know what he's going to be like health-wise when he gets finished with those 2 fights, because I do not think he's taking care of himself. And I got a feeling even guys like Chandler could hurt him badly potentially. And so we don't know what it's going to look like after. And I don't know how many big fights, air quotes, that we're talking about outside of the UFC, can he get through before the show is over? Because I think there's two things. One, he's getting old. He keeps losing. And two, I think you're going to get to the point where he's going to be embarrassed in fights because it's been so long. And I don't know how well he's kept up his skills.
And that's going to do it. I just wanted to get those elemental questions in there so we could sort of get a gauge of what he's looking at in the future, what the UFC is looking at in the future surrounding him. What I want you to do right now is, 1, submit some questions to our Ask Me Anything. 2, subscribe. 3, follow John on Twitter. He is at Hey Not The Face. On Blue Sky and Threads, same handle. You can find me on Twitter, Crooklyn MMA, Threads, Crooklyn949, and Blue Sky, Crooklyn. Our messages are open, so if you have questions, comments, suggestions, ask me anything, questions especially, send those our way so that we can log them and get them set up for next week. Right now, y'all know the drill. From here, until next time, please stay safe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!